Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I am excited because I get to work on projects where I can help patients trust the products they depend on. So this is sort of really exciting for me because I get to talk to a frequent guest of ours. We are talking to the expert, the man, the myth, the legend. Um, what's your name again? Jim Nasser? But but we get to talk to Jim. Jim's really, really cool, and I'll explain a little bit more about Jim. Jim is the chief executive officer of Acor. We've actually had him on before because he talks about computational trust and how blockchain has played a role, but other DLTs, specifically Hedera Hashgraph, has played a role in that. He's currently involved in a variety of discussions. One of the things we talked to him recently about was the idea of fake news and how is his company going to tackle the issue of fake news. He's also been involved in tracking COVID and how that plays itself out. And you're worried. I believe you're working on a variety of data stamping APIs. Is that correct?
Yeah, we are. And thanks as always for having me and the very flattering and inaccurate description. I'll take it. Yeah.
Well, that's picked up on fake news. That's fine.
Exactly. That's another way to prove or disprove, these claims. So well, we're doing quite a bit of work around data stamping, or in simple terms, anchoring transactions, to a public ledger, and really it's all, in the spirit of kind of showing your work, right? Proving that what you're saying is actually what you're doing. And I think that's, it's one of the more simple or simpler use cases for blockchain, this accountability idea and transparency. However, it's one that I think is really, really important to all kinds of use cases. And it's really a building block, as you know, Darshan, all kind of joking aside, I think we think of a blockchain as a practical tool. There's all kinds of things you can do, and then there's all kinds of exotic byproducts and use cases. And of course, these days, so much is being spoken about around NFTs, non-fungible tokens, and stuff like this. But I think in practical terms, particularly for the industries that we're in healthcare, regulated industries, there's some really relatively mundane things you can do to have a lot of value, and they help you build. They'll help you build from a particular, kind of place of, if you like, trust and transparency to the next level, and then you can just keep adding to it.
There's so much to discuss there because I want to get into trust and talk about transparency, but I really, really want to get into something that I think I'm really excited about. But your comment already said, you know what, I'm completely over this, which was NFTs. Mm-hmm. Could we start with the basics? What is an NFT?
Yeah. So let me be clear. I am actually not at all, like, if the impression was that I'm over NFTs, that really isn't the case. I'm actually a big proponent of NFTs, for certain contexts and certain use cases. And it's something that, in fact, we're building into like a technology that we're working on ourselves. So, I just think right now there's a saturation of news and talk about NFTs in one very specific context, right? And I think the more you hear, the more it seems like it's kind of frivolous, right?
Yeah.
And it's been generally around these digital, if you like, images and entertainment concepts. And again, I'm not trying to, take anything away from those. There's a place for that. There's a place for collectibles, and there are people who are very much interested in that. However, I think, again, it kind of, I think it would be, we'd be remiss to miss the point of NFTs because of the use cases we're seeing. Because, ultimately, first of all, let me take a kind of a very quick, if you like, dive primer into what NFTs are. So, as the name implies, a non-fungible token is a token, right? That's the first thing to understand. And what a token is really kind of as a unit of measure and a unit of kind of what I think of as attribution of value creation in a public ledger, right? I think that's important to understand. So, non-fungible token basically is one that essentially is unique. So whatever underlying asset it represents. So it could be that LeBron James dunk that was sold for like $208,000, or it could be the first 5,000 days digital collage that just sold for 69 million, whatever. Or it could be a pair of 1985 Nike Jordans. The underlying asset, right, is some kind of object, physical or digital, or maybe a combination. And then really the token element is a representation on the ledger, right? And it's just basically a hash, if you like it, at its lowest, kind of lowest definition. It's a bunch of letters and numbers and things. It's just a reference. So all to say, an NFT is fundamentally it's a utility that's available to a public ledger, right? You use tokenization for all kinds of, it's used for primarily to kind of have a cryptocurrency that is associated as a unit of value for a public ledger, right? But then you can use that token for all kinds of other purposes. You could create, you could associate it to certain transactions. If you create an object, or if you have a transaction, or if you look something up, you could charge a fee for it, things like this. And that's where tokens would be used. And in this case, for NFT, is really the idea of a unique token, and tied to a unique object is that particular token isn't exchangeable with another one, right? So as example, if you bought one Bitcoin, right, or if you bought one, say, US dollar Tether, right? The token that you use for that, the token reference, is exactly the same as, and completely exchangeable for another dollar or another Bitcoin, right?
Right.
However, so that's the default mode. However, a non-fungible token that's not the case. You couldn't just say that, if you bought, like one Bitcoin as example with your token, and you have it on your wallet, and I bought something with an NFT, they're not exchangeable, right? Even though the price, like if you like the face price could be the same, and it could even be the same category or whatever, but one is fundamentally unique and non-exchangeable, and the other one is, right? So, and in simple terms, like if you go to your corner shop and you give them $10, for, I don't know, you buy a carton of milk and a couple of bananas or something, and then the next customer comes in and he gives them $20 and he gets $10 back and says your $10, that's completely exchangeable, right? There was nothing unique about that.
Right. So here's what I'm hearing, and again, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But the greatest, well, I'm going to first explain it, and then I'm going to see the obvious implications of it, at least in my head. But sure. The all it is a representation of a value of something that's off the chain. So, for example, it might be, if you go to XYZ location as identified on this NFT, mm-hmm. and you go to this location, you'll find what I'm referring to. Mm-hmm. That's what an NFT really is.
It is, but I mean, not just an NFT, but a token in general, can represent that, right? Or that's the basic premise, right? I believe we've spoken about this before. That really, on almost all practical implementations of blockchain these days, maybe in the future it'll be different, but right now, what you have is a reference to an asset, and the asset itself lives outside of the blockchain, right? It could be I don't know, like a document. Yeah. It could be a property. It could be like a physical thing. It could be a document. It could be a combination that lives outside, and then you have a reference to it. And then the real idea, though, is that every time there's a transaction, and transactions are really contextual, right? So it's within the application or within the specific business and use case. Every time there's a transaction, that transaction is recorded on the blockchain along with the original point of entry. Like if let's take a simple case. So for instance, we have this technology called hash load, right? Where you can use our technology to securely collaborate with third parties and have a reference set of transactions that go on the blockchain. But the first time you upload a PDF, there's a creation event, and every time you do anything else thereafter. So when you look at it, when you look at the metadata, when you change it, when you transfer it, when you delete it, every one of those transactions are also being recorded, alongside the original one. So when you look at an audit log, you can see, Jim created this PDF document on April 1st, and then, he changed the metadata on April 2nd, he sent it along to Darshan on April 5th, so on and so forth, right? So it just a bunch of transactions. So that's really kind of the basic, if you like, the very kind of basic way you would use a public ledger or a blockchain, right? And I think, like I mentioned, almost always the asset is off the chain, right? And I think the really interesting, by the way, to me, the really interesting use cases for NFTs are where you kind of essentially transition analog to digital. So for instance, I mentioned this idea of the collectible Nike sneakers. So, what you could do is have a physical RFID tag, and that RFID tag can have a electronic pointer, if you like, to a public ledger. And in fact, this is an exact use case. I'm not making this up. This is real. So now you have a sneaker with an RFID tag that has a unique reference somewhere in the ledger, and then if you happen to sell that to somebody else, right? Like you could sell an NFT for whatever, that right of ownership is also passed along because you have an authentic, asset, digital or physical asset or digital asset, and then you sell it. So now the next person, has it, and there's this like certificate of authenticity, if you like, that kind of goes along. And again, it's one you can definitely see being used as example for luxury brands, right? Because that's a simple use case where if somebody's buying a Louis Vuitton and they're paying a premium price for the handbag, they are okay perhaps for paying a very small or some kind of a transaction fee to ensure that this is an authentic, it's an authentic property. And then if they sell it, the next person also gets that certificate of authenticity that's represented with an NFT.
So I have so many questions that came out of that. So my first question is, what you're saying is it represents something that's off the transaction. My first question is, what makes the value of that raise the value of the asset itself by so much? So yeah. It's just a representation of, we can control and demonstrate authenticity going forward because of what we have. So am I missing something? Or is that just
no, you're not really. And I think this kind of gets into the signal versus noise problem, right? That we're having, not just in this case, but it's around. There are a number of kind of, I think, psychological and social things that are happening. It's outside of technology, but there's definitely a fear of missing out going on, a FOMO. And we saw this a few years ago in 2017, 2018 with the ICO craze, right? Where many people really didn't understand what was going on. Even insiders like myself really, could you really know if somebody was legit or not? Yeah, probably not really. But was there this fear of missing out and this idea of like, wow, if I participate in this, I'm bound to do well because everybody's doing it, and so therefore, so there's this kind of herd mentality and sheep mentality that all of us kind of fell into. I think now what we're seeing with NFTs is this idea that you can essentially mint money because you can have almost anything. You can have things that are like fundamentally you wouldn't consider as being, that interesting, like digital, like a GIF or like seeing a LeBron dunk that they could see freely on YouTube. Is that really worth $208,000? I mean, if you ask me, would I pay that? Absolutely not. To me, it's incredibly frivolous and irresponsible to do so. But people are, they want to do it. That's fine. I mean, it's to everyone their own medicine. But I think the other question though is it worth $28,000 or whatever amount? I think this kind of gets into this idea of, well, how much is a cryptocurrency worth? Like, how much is Bitcoin worth? It's not really asset based. So it's really collective fiction, right? So right now it turns out that that's the price that somebody's willing to pay. There's a, kind of market demand and supply and demand scenario that's for some reason people are willing to pay that kind of those kind of fees. Is that sustainable? I don't think so. But I mean, I don't know. I guess we don't really know. But then the other part, and this is the part that I think is less spoken of, is that right now, at least the way most NFTs are implemented, you have a price structure that's really unsustainable. Like the transaction fee, what was the gas that you spend on Ethereum? There's a lot of like those fees are very high and they're really unstable, right? So I think to me that's the kind of thing that in my mind, because I think like, could I use this for a practical use case? As example, could you use an NFT for representing, for instance, a protocol for a new compound, right? And the statistical methodology that kind of goes with that. And then could that be like an asset that is tied to a researcher or a group of researchers that could then potentially be on a data market for either collaboration or for kind of right of ownership or for whatever, for driving drug discovery forward, right? I think in theory the answer to that is yes, but in practice, are you going to be able to do it? Are you going to have some kind of a pricing structure that really makes it prohibitive for people to participate for mundane or more mundane use case than something like a celebrity's autograph, right? So I think that those are the kind of things that I'm concerned about. Is if you're going to implement this, is to implement it in a way that's sustainable, predictable, stable, and it allows you to actually build a business model on it, and not tied necessarily because your name is Tom Brady.
So what I would say is the fundamental problem I have with tying it to LeBron's dunk, for example, is the idea of tying an NFT, which is non-fungible, to a fungible asset. And what I mean by that is, as you pointed out, I can see LeBron's dunk on YouTube whenever I want.
But that's the thing there, and this is where we kind of get into the whole Louis Vuitton. I'm gonna bastardize this and call it the Louis Vuitton, kind of manifesto. So the idea is that particular LeBron dunk was the official one, right? It wasn't. That was like the one that was quote endorsed by whoever, by LeBron and the NBA and whatever, right? So that there was only one official one, right? Because ultimately somebody, their video and broadcasting rights, somebody owns that right. And then that 10-second, segment, is part of their intellectual property, what they're paid for, right? That's the idea. Everything else that we see on YouTube or whatever, that's not the official one. So I think that in that context, the actual asset is not fungible. It is unique, right? There's only one official one.
So the officiality of it is non-fungible. The visualization itself may be non-fungible.
Yeah, but that kind of gets into this whole idea of if you're like ripping music and things like this, that right. that if you're it's not the official one, and therefore if you're paying a premium, you probably want to get the real thing. And this kind of gets into like all kinds of things like merchandise and things like this. If you're paying a $5,000 premium for a bag that looks identical to one that's $5,000 less, you're really paying the cachet. The premium goes with the authenticity of that, right?
Sure. No, and that's 100% true. Now let me ask you this question: when you are dealing with an NFT, does it have to be to an object that already exists, or can it be for a future object? And what I mean by that is, let me give you an example. Yeah. You talked about the dunk. Could it be for, if you buy this NFT today, I will make a dunk in your honor tomorrow. And if I make that dunk, that officially belongs to you, and the NFT goes along with it.
Yeah. It's a good question, Darshan. I mean, I don't know of an example like it. I don't, I would imagine for sure in the world of DeFi and financial instruments. I mean, you obviously know about futures. So, could you have a futures type of instrument tied into an NFT? I mean, probably, right? But I don't want to overspeak on that. It's not an area that I have a lot of expertise in. Okay. One thing I was kicking around, with a client, and it wasn't about NFTs. It was really all to do with like vital records and fire
That was
bundle
actually
and things like this. And right now, with particularly with the with the George Floyd case being in the news every day, we hear all these like gory details about about his death and all of the details and so imagine if you're like if the vital record fire template, the bundle that has the data and the resources that get this information, if that was essentially a non-fund or was anchored by a non-fungible token, and then as you add more updates to it, right, those high value updates such as additional autopsy results are still kind of covered within the within this NFT. And would that be valuable for research? Would that be valuable potentially for movie rights or whatever? I mean, and again, I don't want to speculate on things that are like way out there, but could that be the case? I mean, I would say yes. You could definitely do it. You could definitely have something like that, like a fire bundle that refers to a bunch of health records, right? Or like a patient observation, in this case, mortality, with mortality data and vital records data that is infrequently updated, but nonetheless, the NFT refers back to that bundle. So could that be a possibility? Yeah, I mean, I think it could be.
I think what really for us in pharma and life sciences, the way it really starts making sense is when you start tracking things down the supply chain and you start going, you know what, I have a product that's being made and I got the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient from place X. We're tracking that. We're adding value, making something more out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So does the NFT necessarily refer to one object or an evolving object? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's really it could be a bundle, like I was suggesting. It doesn't have to be one very discrete thing. It could be a compound thing. I think in the case of the kind of the supply chain that you mentioned, though, again, things like, and you and I worked on this back, a couple of years ago. So your active ingredients and your kind of non-active ingredients, if it's very difficult physically to separate what is unique amongst them is, I don't really know if an NFT could be used in that context. Perhaps it could be used, in like a final, like in the, once you get into the kitchen to finish the compound or something like that. But I don't really know. I mean, could somebody experiment with it? For sure. Could you do it with tokens though in general and just using the idea of track and trace with a blockchain anchor? For sure, you can certainly do it that way.
So that raised the next question I was going to ask, which was, does NFT have to be tied to a physical location? And you talk about RFIDs. Yeah. So theoretically, I could track my product going from the manufacturer to the pharmacy, and that NFT would tie to the RFID specifically. And that would be completely legit, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is definitely not, right? I mean, it's not. In fact, remember, many of the use cases, in fact, the predominant use case is one where it's a digital object. So there is no location per se anyway, right? Or the location somewhere in the cloud or it's not really kind of like a physical kind of location or physical entity. But yeah, certainly not. It's not, it should. There is no real dependency on the location. You could make it so it is as part of the attributes of the underlying asset. Like for instance, if you wanted to, again, this is kind of a stretch, but if there was a famous architect building like essentially one-off, like Picassos of buildings or architecture, you could conceivably see that being represented by an NFT, right? And then obviously then there's a physical location to it.
So a Banksy painting, for example, which would be graffiti, you could put an NFT tied to the location and say that's what they're.
You could do that, and I think we've heard that. Yeah. It's unusual. I think a lot of times when you think digital, though, the location really is not. Is now moving from location to location or the chain of custody certainly is interesting, but the actual like location, like hey, is it stored in an Amazon S3 bucket versus a Google Cloud storage or whatever, that isn't that interesting most of the time.
So let's talk about the value. You talked about Ethereum and transaction costs and how that can be difficult. I guess what I'm wondering is if you've got a situation where the NFT itself, not the NFT, sorry, the ledger itself becomes too expensive to maintain, and the ledger dies, does the value of the NFT automatically go to zero at that point? Of the NFT, obviously not the underlying asset.
Yeah. No. So, there are standards to kind of. I mean, first of all, I'm by no means suggesting that Ethereum is going to go away or whatever. There are definitely some transaction costs, and when you hear commentary on NFTs, you hear this idea of, well, this thing costs, I don't know, like 500 or 5,000 trees just to buy this NFTs, because of the way Ethereum currently works with the power of the proof of work kind of consensus algorithm, and the fact that consumes a lot of energy, and by design, right? Same thing with Bitcoin. But the main thing though here is that there are some standards for these tokens and interoperability across them. So the Ethereum tokens, they comply to what's called ERC 721, which is adopted by other folks, and there's a larger community than just a small set of Ethereum developers. But then also more and more, I think one of the kind of underlying concepts in blockchain is cross-chain interoperability. So there's a lot of effort happening by different vendors and specialists, and even people like us, to make sure that whatever is being built, has the ability to traverse across different underlying blockchain networks, because nobody believes that there will be just one network, right? I think or one protocol. I think that clearly is not the case, and shouldn't be the case. You look as example, Bitcoin, is very, very good at certain things. It's very secure. It's designed to be slow. It's designed to be inefficient, but there's a purpose for that. But then there are other technologies such as Hedera Hashgraph, which is not, kind of what you would consider as a kind of traditional blockchain. You don't have this idea of chaining blocks. However, it is a distributed ledger technology. It is very fast. Its transactions are tied to a stable coin in US dollars, so it's very predictable, and you get to finality of transactions very quickly. So, they're both legitimate. They could both be used for different purposes. And then there's also this idea of a legacy, right? So if you look at, for instance, DeFi, the majority of DeFi has been implemented on Ethereum. That's where the community is. So realistically, that's not going to just move to another platform or anytime soon. So all to say, I think that the idea of having multiple underlying protocols is one that, I certainly see being around for a long time. I think some protocols are going to disappear. Some are going to merge, or perhaps, become components into bigger protocols. But I don't think there's going to be just one protocol, right? That will be the only quote blockchain technology. It will be multiple ones. So therefore, if you have an asset on one blockchain, you should be able to get, do a transaction to anyone on a different blockchain and be able to make that happen, right? It's the same idea as the internet. Imagine if I told you that, like you and I could not be on SteamYard here because, I happen to I'm running a Linux server for my website, and they're not, right? That'd be a ludicrous statement, right? Because ultimately, that stuff is abstracted from us, and all of us use the internet, even though there's millions or billions of different servers out there and lots of different technologies, and it all kind of the protocol that we use to communicate, the RESTful APIs allow us to interact as if we're all using the same technology.
So that, I guess the question that I was wondering was not so much will it completely disappear. I guess I did inherently ask that question. But the second component of that, which is, should the ownership of such blockchains be given to, for example, a government entity like the FDA? So if you're tracking a drug supply chain, instead of Darshan Kulkarni running the supply chain, is it better for the FDA to run it, or does that inherently avoid innovation?
Yeah, look, so I think we have to look at the legacy of these things. So fundamentally, and I think you heard me say this, I think blockchain is really a composition of three different things. There's a technology which we have talked about many times, including tokenization. Then there is this idea of kind of value creation attribution, which is a token specifically, but it's more than that. There's this philosophy of somebody who's doing some kind of value, providing value to the network, and they're rewarded for it. But then the third pillar really is this idea of removing centralized control. So, I certainly don't think the answer is that we're going to turn the blockchain over to a government agency, because now essentially you've really kind of defeated and nullified the idea of decentralizing control, right? Because you could conceivably say, and this is what many people like Amazon and Google would say, which is, hey, look, we're really good at doing this, so just let us do it, right? But I think the downside though is that ultimately they control, you are their product, and they control all of the key elements, and as a result you wind up with Jeff Bezos becoming X amount richer, whereas everybody else is getting poorer, right? And I think fundamentally I certainly don't think that governments having control over blockchain technologies and protocols is the answer. I think what is an answer, and as not necessarily the answer, is a governance model that is, one, transparent, but two, is composed of different stakeholders who both collaborate and compete, in across different industries, and very much operate the network as a collective, but a collective that has checks and balances, right? So it's not a collective where essentially the loudest group wins, or the people who've been there longest win, because what you wind up dealing with is, as example, what we've seen with Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, and this kind of factions develop where you essentially have political differences, and as a result, you have forks, and the network itself really suffers. I think it's a very tricky thing, right? It's not simple, because if you start with a network with five leaders or 5 nodes or whatever, pretty simple to manage that and govern it. But if it becomes successful, now you have 1 million people on it. That same 5-group governance model may not work, and probably doesn't work. So I think those are areas where I think there's real opportunity for kind of innovation. But certainly I'm not a believer that you just flip it over to like SEC and say you guys deal with it.
But I guess maybe I'm missing the component. I hear you that the inherent goal of blockchain and Bitcoin and Hedera Hashgraph, et cetera, is decentralization. What value does decentralization have in the context of life sciences? What advantage does it give us that a centralized organization like the FDA, for example, cannot?
Yeah, well, I mean, and here's the thing. Look, FDA, and again, I'm a big believer in this. Regulators have a role to play, in any kind of blockchain solution that's around life sciences and healthcare, because it's a highly regulated industry. And I think what the regulators can do, and again, it's a simple use case, is this idea of mandating transparency, mandating compliance to regulations, such as GDPR or the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or whatever else you want to think of. There's many of them. Right, 21 CFR 11. There's all kinds of things in there that right now is managed so poorly and such a voluminous and laborsome way. All of that could be done much more efficiently by insisting on having a track and trace of the activities on a blockchain, with the FDA being one of the key stakeholders participating in this, as opposed to controlling it. So, but what is the value of decentralizing it? Is really the fact that you can, when you have one central entity owning it, you have to take their word for it, right? And there's many occasions, either because of kind of competitive reasons or individual interests, or because they're just not very good at what they do, that they really don't do the job correctly, or they don't do it in a manner that could be done, or they certainly don't do it in a way that's transparent. So you mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot, you've spoken to a lot of folks in public health. Well, anything with the word public in it, there's a public interest, right? COVID as example, everything that's going on. We're not just kind of like bystanders looking on. It's impacting all of us, right? This is an important element of our lives, every one of us. So therefore, the idea of transparency and being able to really see that things are happening, proving your work, is important to all of us. So therefore, if one entity controls all of that, I mean, good luck getting that to happen. I don't think, and I think this is where you kind of go from this idea that you talked about earlier of computational trust, which is where we're relying on cryptography and technology and decentralized computing architecture to essentially an intermediary for trust. And I think we're in a place where to just say, you know what, let's trust Facebook as an example, because Mark Zuckerberg knows best, and we have seen the results, right? We have seen what's happening. And I think the counter movement is there to say, you know what, no, there's got to be some other way. Why can we not act as a group of peers within a software that's transparent, that allows us to act as a group of peers, and then have a governance that allows interaction to happen. Again, not simple. I'm not trying to trivialize it. Distributed computing and decentralized computing and decentralized business is by no means simple, right? But the question is, what is your priority? What's the more important thing that you're trying to accomplish here? And I think, again, from my perspective, certainly the idea of my health records being at the mercy of Google, because Ascension happens to sell 50 million records to them, and they can do whatever they want without any kind of input from me, any kind of disclosure, any kind of collaboration. I don't like that idea, right? I never consented to that.
Right. So which raises the next question, which is, if you're talking about decentralization of control, you're also talking in many ways about decentralization of ownership. And if you're talking about decentralization of ownership, is there any way for the person or company that started that blockchain or the distributed ledger to be able to sell it, or does that inherently disappear?
I mean, but I don't think kind of decentralizing control is necessarily equivalent, or at least not on a one-to-one to ownership, because again, and it's just like anything else, right? You could be, if you like, just like owning a business as a simple example. You could be an active investor versus a passive investor, right? Or you could have different degrees of ownership. But if you're, for instance, like just like a read node, and all you do is read transactions, that ability of that control, if you like, or that level of ownership is different than if you're a write node, right? So there's some nuances. But back to your point of, could somebody essentially sell, blockchain and everything that kind of you've done along with it? Yes, I think it's a possibility. I think more likely though is this idea of a fork, which is that at some point, for some reason, it could be a dissolution of some people's interests or financial reasons or political and kind of philosophical reasons. There could be this idea of saying that, we're at an impasse. So now we're going to create a fork that says that, this group of people are going to continue this project, and take the code, but they're going to make it their way. And when there's a fork, especially when it's a, kind of a public ledger, right, where the code is open source, so therefore anyone could, in theory, fork it. I mean, that can lead to all kinds of issues, right? Is it doable? Sure, it's doable. It's not, it's frictiony. There's a lot of friction when you create a fork, right? And there are changes and there's implications. Some people may lose, and this has happened, right, quite a bit. You can look this up. May lose their cryptocurrency or may not, upgrade in the right way, etc. And it just creates quite a lot of noise. We saw this, again, just a couple of years ago with the Bitcoin community, right?
Yeah.
So,
there are tons more questions. Let me ask you one last question before we call it. One of the key components of this was the idea that you can tie an NFT to, for example, an RFID, right? And then we said, well, what about an evolving product? And you said, well, that may not be the best case, at least right now. That may evolve, but for now, it's better to tie that RFID or whatever to a final product. Unless that RFID is tied almost innately into the product. So unlike, for example, a Louis Vuitton bag, you're tying the drug into the actual capsule. If you're tying it to a Louis Vuitton bag, what stops me from every 6 months taking that RFID, putting it onto a really good fake, and if someone tries to check it against the blockchain,
Yeah.
the RFID will match the blockchain.
Yeah. So this is where it kind of gets into not the digital world, but really the manifestation of clever, usable ways of embedding in a very non-intrusive way, right? Embedding something that anchors the physical to digital, right? Because if it was simple as like a little loop with a tag on it, then you could just remove it from one and put it somewhere else, and it was as simple as that. Then you would basically defeat the object of the exercise. I think there's got to be some cleverness built into the actual physical design and the usability of that. And it's not like a one size fits all, right? This depends on the specific product we're talking about, and particularly if it's physical, and how do you really manifest, is authenticity under different kind of conditions, not just on the happy path. So, it's not a very good answer, or not specific, but it's one that I think you really have to look at the very specific, underlying products, right?
I agree. So Jim, based on our discussion, what is one question you'd like to ask the audience?
Yeah, I think the good news about what you do here is that you kind of, incite imagination and good ideas about things. I would say, I just think practical. We talked a lot about NFTs today, and it wasn't necessarily my plan to talk or not talk about it. Just that's the way it evolved. So to me, I would love to hear from your audience on, based on what they've heard, where do they think NFTs could be used in healthcare? What could an NFT represent in healthcare, or in life sciences? Because again, I have my thoughts, and like I mentioned, in earnest, we're actively building technologies right now with NFTs, but for healthcare. So obviously, we have some ideas, but I think people have a lot of great imagination and good ideas and context and other things. So love to hear about it, because and by the way, this kind of goes back to this whole idea of, can you build it in a way that's sustainable, right? Because if I created, if my NFT creation event, if that costs $500, that's, to me, that is an unsustainable model for me, for like in healthcare, in almost every case, unless, as example, you're talking about, let's say some kind of an exotic MRI machine that costs $1 million, right? That has the stamp and it's physical, that I get. Then if you're paying $1,000 for that, yeah, that's a minor fraction. But you take those very exotic use cases aside, I don't think it's sustainable to do it in the way it's currently implemented. But the good news is, Ethereum is by no means the only way of doing it, right? There's a bunch of other underlying protocols you can use. So it doesn't. I don't think people should get hung up on, wow, it costs $10,000 just to create one.
Yeah, I agree. So Jim, I'm going to do a quick recap. During this podcast, we landed up talking about what are NFTs. We talked about fraud and sort of tracking. We talked a little bit about why is the value of NFTs so high, if that makes sense. The tying of an NFT to a real world object by the context of an RFID. We talked about examples like supply chain. We talked about the value of decentralization. We talked about how do you sell a blockchain and the NFTs associated with it. But also we talked about more appropriately forking. And we also discussed NFTs as a fungible asset and as a future asset. Did I miss anything?
NFTs is a non-fungible asset, but yes. No. It's good capture.
Yeah, thank you. As we discussed, nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical or technological advice of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. Jim, if someone wants to talk to you about a potential venture involving blockchain or Hedera Hashgraph, how can they reach you?
Just on LinkedIn, I'm there, or Twitter at JNasser. Happy to connect to whoever and take it from there.
Sounds good. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment. Please subscribe. You can find me at Darshan Talks on Twitter or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you, Darshan. Have a good day.